In today's video, we have the latest updated NHL rumors talking about players like Patrik Laine, Oliver Ekman-Larsson, and Matt Dumba, as well as free agent Alex Pietrangelo. We also have some signings to discuss as well. We'll jump into all the latest news coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now we have a lot to cover today. There's a lot of news and rumors that we want to talk about in today's video, so let's dive right in. First up, we have a couple of news items regarding free agency. First up, Sam Gagner has signed a one-year deal worth $850,000 to remain with the Detroit Red Wings. He would have been an unrestricted free agent here not too long from now when free agency kicks in, but he decided to stay with Detroit. A little bit surprising. I wasn't sure if they'd bring him back. Of course, they got him from the Oilers in the Andreas Athanasiou trade earlier this past season. So, obviously he's a veteran guy. Been around the league for a while, bounced around quite a bit, but he can certainly provide some leadership and, kind of a versatile player you can put in a variety of situations. So he remains with Detroit. We also found out that Trevor Lewis, longtime member of the Los Angeles Kings, will not be brought back. He is definitely heading to free agency. He's open to going anywhere, apparently, for what the quotes from him were indicating, that he's even willing to move east, doesn't matter, just looking for the best opportunity to continue his NHL career. Same thing with Dale Weiss of Montreal. I know there were some reports earlier that he was heading to Europe, but apparently that was not accurate. Dale Weiss is intending to try to stay in the NHL and will not be re-signing with Montreal, so he'll be looking for another opportunity with a different NHL franchise. Now, a quick update too on the Capitals captain Alex Ovechkin. Now, one thing that we found out regarding his negotiation with the Capitals on an extension is apparently he's not using an agent. He's doing negotiations completely on his own. Of course, we had reports back in the last couple of weeks indicating the Capitals offered a deal around $9.5 to $10 million, but then we've heard reports out of Russia again indicating he's looking for closer to 12 and wants something comparable to what Connor McDavid is being paid. So we'll see what happens in that regard, but just an interesting tidbit I thought I'd let you know that Ovechkin is doing his own contract, kind of like what we saw Drew Doughty do with the Kings not that long ago. Quick update as well on Patrick Hornqvist, formerly of the Pittsburgh Penguins. Apparently he's had a fair bit to say, some interesting stuff since that trade took place between the Pens and the Panthers. He said basically he waived his no-trade clause because if Pittsburgh didn't want me, I don't want to be there. Florida wanted me, so I decided to do it. So essentially, he was pretty blindsided, he said. He was not very pleased with this. I've heard reports that other Penguins teammates were not happy over the trade either. And we saw a picture posted to social media that it looks like he took all of his Penguins gear and just dumped it out on his front lawn, like in the front of his house. Doesn't want it anymore. So clearly some hard feelings there. And we'll see if we get any more details on this. But, not surprising. He did not expect to be traded. Rutherford basically said that he did not see him being in the top power play unit, probably wasn't necessarily going to be in a top 6 role, and that they just felt it was best for the team and the organization to move on, even though he was, he's a good teammate, good in the locker room, and all those other intangibles that you get from a guy like Hornqvist. But ultimately, that's what I kind of said in the trade videos. I figured if they don't see him playing in the top 6 and top power play, he's making over $5 million. It makes sense that he'd be expendable. Apparently, Hornqvist learned of the trade as well through social media. I know Kevin Weeks of NHL Network was one of the first ones, and might even been the first one to put it out there, saying it was a confirmed trade. And he hadn't even been asked about his no trade at that point. He later agreed to it, like I said, because he figured if they don't want me, I don't want to be there. So it's definitely some hard feelings between Hornqvist and the Penguins on how things ended. Now let's get into the latest free agent and trade rumors for today. I want to kick things off with the latest on Alex Pietrangelo, and this comes from Elliot Friedman in his latest 31 Thoughts podcast with Jeff Merrick, where they were talking about the one of the top free agents here in this year's class, and talking about where he could end up. And Friedman wonders now as well. Obviously, he's mentioned Vegas and Toronto outside of St. Louis as being the top contenders, and it's well documented. And I think many feel that Vegas is probably the top one, with Toronto being number 2, but that's just what people feel. Of course, that's not confirmed. But Friedman mentions the Florida Panthers as maybe being one of those stealth teams that you may not see or think of. But even though there were a lot of reports earlier about them wanting to cut payroll, we've heard some different kind of comments from new GM Bill Zito. Maybe they're not going down that road. There's been reports that they may not re-sign Mike Hoffman and Evgeny Dodonov, so obviously there's a big savings, but maybe instead of not, spending on the forward group, that they might try to build from the back end. I mean, they have a very expensive coach in Joe Quenneville. They have a very expensive goalie in Sergei Bobrovsky. They've been trying to spend big on this team and make it better. They just haven't had a whole lot of success yet. That maybe they would be one of those teams to kind of do that from the blue line. Obviously, you need a really good blue line to really contend. And if you have Pietrangelo, you can put Aaron Ekblad as the number 2 right side D. That certainly make things a lot better back there. Of course, we saw them move Mike Matheson out, which that's going to help because he was a bit of a turnover machine in my opinion. So they're only going to be looking up. So I don't really think the odds of him going to Florida are very high, but I can see the fact that they would probably make sense to some degree here, especially given the fact of the state tax savings in Florida. So there's that appeal, nice weather, there's all those other intangibles that you get from going to Florida. And then you throw in the fact that, you throw in a player like Pietrangelo and this team gets a lot better. They have a lot of other great pieces there. Then they've been one of those teams the last few years that have been expected to do much better, but have continuously disappointed. So we'll see if they become players for his services should he hit free agency. I still say Vegas and the Leafs are going to be 1-2, and that's more likely where he goes, but we'll have to keep our eye on the Panthers and see how they decide to proceed here. Now, we have the latest updates on the Matt Dumba situation as well from various NHL insiders, indicating that it sounds like the price tag for Dumba is starting to soften a little bit, and that GM Bill Guerin might have to accept a softer deal if he really wants to move to defenseman, and he doesn't have to do that. He's not pressured to. Sometime in the next year before the expansion draft, I would expect that he does get moved, but he can be patient here. But the fact of the matter is they want a top center, or at least a top 2 center, and it's just proving very challenging. If you look around the NHL on what teams would be the most likely ones wanting Matt Dumba, they're just not going to be in a situation where they have so many extra top centers that they can part with one. So it's not an easy player to trade for. I mean, same thing with Dumba, a top right shot D is also not, really easy to trade for either. So when you have the perfect match of somebody with a center who can move and a right shot D that can move, it's just not lining up here. I mean, you look around the NHL and it's tough. I mean, there are a few scenarios where it could work. Like, for example, Sean Monahan in Calgary for Matt Dumba. The Flames have been linked to being one of the interested parties. But I'm not really convinced they're going to move Monahan because now they're going to have a big hole in their center ice. So it's that kind of situation. So the latest reports indicate that he would be willing to either accept probably a combination of 2 things here, with one being maybe a really good prospect center and a first-round pick in this year's draft, ideally a higher end, so probably in the top half of the NHL draft. And then, of course, the other scenario would be more like a top scoring winger. Obviously, they need someone who can put the puck in the net. They do need a center iceman as well. But it'd be a step in the right direction. Like, there were early reports of Dumba for Brock Besser, and I don't really think that's likely to happen. But it's that kind of player that I think they would be interested in here. It would also make sense for them if they can't get a center iceman. But like we said, Bill Guerin can be patient with this kind of scenario and wait till he gets the right deal. He doesn't have to rush just now. Of course, as we get into the latest updates on Patrik Laine, which is going to talk about next, you'll see that one of the teams we're going to talk about, the linked, is maybe division rivals Winnipeg and Minnesota. Now, it might be a little less likely to see a trade between these two teams, but if at the end of the day both GMs feel like they both get better and they both kind of get what they want, maybe we'll see it happen. And it is happening, interdivision trades, more than we used to see. Now, I came across a couple of articles talking about some Line A trades where some different teams that we hadn't talked about before. So I thought we'd kind of raise those and see what everybody thinks. One of the teams in these articles was Minnesota. Now, of course, you're looking at the fact that Winnipeg's looking for a top defenseman and a center iceman. So the mock trade that they were suggesting between these two teams would be Line A going to Minnesota in exchange for Dumba and maybe Joel Eriksson and maybe a fairly high draft pick as well. So ideally a first rounder, probably the 2021 first rounder they have from Pittsburgh, because they do have that extra first rounder that they got in the Jason Zucker trade, which was either going to be 2020 or 2021, and the Penguins have opted to keep their pick in 2020 since it ended up being higher since they lost in the qualifying round to Montreal. So obviously that would be for 2021 now, so that wouldn't be too bad of a trade. I'm not sure that the Jets do it, but obviously they get a high first round pick, so they get a pretty solid prospect. They get a top right shot defenseman, and they get themselves, not really a high end center, but a good center. So it's not perfect, but it's something that I think each team could at least talk about and consider. But that's the kind of deal that we're likely going to have to see Minnesota do for Dumba. I mean, if you look around at some of the other top wingers, maybe that they could consider looking at besides Laine, like maybe, like I mentioned, the Flames, maybe trading him on him, but maybe they would do Johnny Gaudreau instead. Maybe we could see a Dumba for Gaudreau trade. That would make more sense. It doesn't get Minnesota and Bill Guerin his center, but it does get him the kind of forward who can be a game breaker and put up a lot of points and be, a major offensive boost to your lineup. So that's something that I do think we were going to see them consider here. But it really boils down to how badly he wants to move this player. There's no rush, and it can take their time, go into the season with him on their roster. And so they have really right up until the expansion draft to kind of get something done. He's under contract for an extended time, so there's no big rush that way. So we will see what happens, but I think that more than likely, if Guerin wants to move him, he's just not going to get that center iceman he's looking for. They're probably going to have to do that through the draft and build up from up within would be the most likely scenario that I see unfolding for them to get that player. Now, back to Patrik Laine here. Like I said, obviously those two players that we're talking about today could be linked together, and maybe, it could make sense if both GMs feel it's going to help their rosters overall. But there's certainly some other interesting teams as well that I wanted to give you the mock trades in these articles. One was from the Hockey News, and there's also one from the Montreal Gazette for the Montreal Canadiens. So, for example, if you look at Laine going to the Avalanche, that's another team that's been mentioned. Obviously, they need center and defense help. So, clearly, the mock trade here was Ryan Graves or Nikita Zadorov. I think if we're picking a defenseman that the Jets would want, they'd probably pick Graves. So let's say Ryan Graves, as well as prospect defenseman Connor Timmins, who certainly has a lot of upside, battled some injuries though, so there is some risk with Timmins, but has the potential to be, I think, a good top four right shot D. And then, of course, there's Tyson Jost being the center iceman coming back. I mean, Jost came out of junior with a lot of high-end potential, has struggled with consistency, but he's also not getting a real high spot in the lineup on a consistent basis either. So I'm not sure that would be something Winnipeg would jump at. Again, another division rival in Colorado. So you have to be careful there. You don't want to make your division rival too much stronger than, and kind of push yourself out of a playoff spot or whatever. So you got to be careful with those kind of divisional trades. But at the same time, it's an okay trade, but I'm not sure that the Jets do that one. Of course, we already talked about teams like Columbus and Carolina yesterday. The latest from the Montreal trade from the Montreal Gazette that I was looking at here showed Max Domi being the center iceman going with a couple of defensemen, with Brett Kulak with being one of them, and then one of their young defensemen, either Noah Juleson or Cale Fleury, and then a first-round draft pick. Now, I think a trade like that would be something that the Jets would be looking for. I don't know if they'd want Kulak. I honestly think they'd push for Ben Sherratt. I don't know if Montreal would want to do that, though. But at the same time, that, to me, as much as we've heard lately, and I reported yesterday that the Habs are, the insiders are saying that the Habs are really not in this market and they're not really pushing for Laine. Like, there could be some talks, but they're not really serious about it at this point. That, I don't know that we're going to see anything like that happen. But at the same time, I think they could put together one of the better packages that Winnipeg would like. These teams have done business before, and I think it could be a very interesting move. Now, another team as well that's been mentioned here is New Jersey. Now, of course, New Jersey's a team on the rise. They could certainly benefit from a guy like Laine. Imagine him playing with, Nico Hischier, Jack Hughes. Like, that could be, a great fit, obviously, for their young center iceman to have a top-scoring winger to play with. They suggested trading Damon Severson, who's been mentioned in some trade talk lately. Perhaps, falling out of favor there a little bit, might be on the move. He's a good, fairly young defenseman here still. They also included Pavel Zacha in this year's first-round pick that they hold from the Vancouver Canucks. So, obviously, the Devils have multiple first-round picks this year. They could use one of those, whether it be the Canuck one or a different one. I don't think they'd trade their own because it's fairly high, but Winnipeg could insist on that as well, so hard to say how negotiations would go. I think Severson would be good for Winnipeg. I'm not sure about Zacha, though. I don't see him giving the help they want, so again, I don't see that being a fantastic deal. Like, all of these teams that we're talking about have something that would help Winnipeg and kind of entice them, but I'm just not sure we're going to see it happen. Like, none of these deals are just an absolute, blow you out of the water, yes, you have to do it kind of trade. Like Sportsnet's Ken Wiebe reported that he feels that more likely if a Laine trade happens, it probably won't be this year. There's more likely to be next year because he has another year in his deal. Next year's going to be negotiations for a new contract. It could start now, but there's been no reports of that. And then once things happen, if negotiations aren't going well, depending on how this season goes with his play and how he's used, then that could certainly change things. I mean, many feel he's likely going to be getting a contract comparable to Captain Blake Wheeler. That could prove costly for Winnipeg, especially with the other holes in their lineup. It's not so much that they don't feel he's worth the money. It's just paying him that money at the same time as without having a 2C or another stronger blue liner. It just makes it really hard for them to continue to fill those holes without moving out something significant. So that's where all the trade chatter kind of comes from. So let me know which of these deals do you think would be best for Laine. Do you think the odds of him moving are good? And if so, where do you think he ends up? Personally, I think that the odds are slim, and it's more likely to happen next year than it would be this year, but we'll have to wait and see on that. Now, lastly here, I want to talk about Oliver Ekman-Larsson. We had some updates from Craig Morgan, insider for the Coyotes, about some of the players that have been rumored to be on the move. Now, of course, a lot of this trade chatter with the Coyotes started before they got their new GM in place, with, of course, is now Bill Armstrong. He's reporting now that he's not so sure that they're going to move Darcy Kuemper, that Bill Armstrong might have a different feeling about how to do this, and that either they will put the price tag up and they'll do it for the right price, but it's not a given. Essentially, they're going to be looking for a fair bit because of how valuable his contract is, at least a first-round pick, if not more, and that there's not a given that he goes. Of course, we heard that Nicholas Chalmerson does not want to waive his no-trade, so he likely stays too. However, he did report as well, again, just to kind of keep it out there, that Oliver Ekman-Larsson does appear quite open to some new scenery and a change of pace here. So his name is out there. We still have a lot of reports on the same teams kind of kicking tires and having some preliminary discussions, so we'll see what comes from that. But Oliver Ekman-Larsson is still one of the top names out there on the NHL TSN trade bait board. They still feel it's pretty likely. Craig Morgan is reporting something here very similar as well, so I do think that's quite possible. And a lot of the other Coyotes players, if they don't have trade protection and they're down to a year on their deal, then they're very likely to have a lot of interest from around the NHL as well, like Derek Stepan. I said you get Goligoski, Demers. There's also some other players on that roster that kind of fit that description, so I think they'll hold on to their younger players, especially ones under contract for an extended time, and we'll see from there. But according to Craig Morgan, they're still expected to be busy, but just maybe not quite as busy as what was being reported a few weeks ago with a complete fire sale. So we'll see what happens and how they proceed in the desert. So that is all your latest news for today. Let me know your thoughts on everything down in the comments, and we'll discuss further. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content. And give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.